January 1944. A thin veil of snow settles over the perimeter fences of a remote Allied prisoner of war hospital on the English coast. The wind carries the distant rumble of aircraft. The kind that never let anyone forget the war was still tightening its grip on Europe. Inside the compound, steam rises from canvas tents warmed by coal stoves, their shadows flickering against the white morning sky. That army ambulance rolls to a stop, its tires grinding against the frozen mud. Medics open the rear doors, revealing wounded German airmen pulled from the wreckage of a downed bomber. Their uniforms are torn, their faces gray with shock and cold. Some are barely conscious. At the entrance of the ward stands a young American nurse from the U.S. Army Nurse Corps. Her breath forms small clouds as she steadies herself. She has treated soldiers from many nations, but there's always a moment, a brief hesitation, when the enemy arrives. Duty demands calm hands. War demands something colder. Yet as she steps forward, reaching instinctively for the stretcher, the quiet truth hangs in the air. Compassion has crossed the barbed wire long before she does. And to understand how such a moment could unfold, we must first look at the world that shaped it. By the beginning of 1944, the Second World War had entered a phase defined by exhaustion, shifting momentum, and an unrelenting demand for manpower across every front. The Allies were preparing for a large-scale return to Western Europe, but until that moment came, the skies over Britain and the Channel had become one of the war's busiest battlegrounds. Bomber streams moved both ways. Fighters clashed daily. And for every aircraft shot down, for every mission that failed to return, there were survivors, men pulled from the sea, from fields, or from the burnt skeletons of their machines. Many of those who survived the fall were not Allied airmen. They were German, often from the Luftwaffe, who had been captured in Britain or brought ashore by naval patrols. As the number of prisoners grew, the Allied command established specialized facilities, POW hospitals designed to treat wounded enemy personnel before transferring them to long-term camps. These hospitals were intentionally placed away from large civilian areas but kept close enough to coastal or air patrol corridors to receive casualties quickly. The presence of enemy wounded on British soil created a subtle tension that echoed through every tent and corridor. German POWs were no longer distant symbols of aggression. They were men who breathed the same cold air, groaned under the same injuries, and bled the same way Allied soldiers did. International law required they be cared for, and the Geneva Convention of 1929 clearly stated that medical personnel were to treat all wounded without discrimination. For the men and women serving there, this rule was not theoretical, it was daily routine. Among those responsible for carrying out this duty were members of the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, many of whom had been deployed to Britain in the months leading up to the planned invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. Their tasks were challenging long before enemy prisoners arrived. They worked in unpredictable conditions, frequently understaffed, often surrounded by the unsettling combination of stillness and violence, quiet nights broken by sudden influxes of wounded, orderly wards transformed into chaotic triage centers within minutes. The arrival of German prisoners added another layer of emotional complexity. Many nurses carried personal losses from the Pacific or European fronts. Some had brothers flying in bomber groups. Others had seen firsthand the devastation caused by Luftwaffe raids on British cities. The uniform on the stretcher was more than fabric. It was a reminder, yet the strict protocol was clear. A wound is a wound. A life is a life. An enemy soldier on the operating table was no different from an Allied one, at least, not in what medical ethics demanded. Still, there were practical reasons for providing enemy prisoners with thorough care. Wounded POWs often held information, flight routes, unit insignias, tactical habits that intelligence officers could analyze. A survivor could be questioned. A dead man could not. Thus, medical neutrality aligned with military necessity, though the medical staff themselves were rarely concerned with this strategic layer. Their world was built around immediate needs: stopping bleeding, stabilizing fractures, preventing infection, and keeping the ward functioning through bitter winters. Language barriers created moments of quiet confusion. Some German prisoners spoke halting English. Some spoke none. Nurses used gestures, tone, and the universal language of wounds to communicate. There were no translators stationed in every tent, and interrogators arrived only after the critical phase had passed. In those early hours, interactions were simple: bandage, breathe, rest, stripped of ideology, reduced to something human and fragile. Yet behind every simple act lay a difficult truth. Proximity changes perception. A man is harder to hate when he is no longer a distant uniform, but a shaking figure on a stretcher. Still, this environment did not encourage personal attachment. Regulations forbade unnecessary conversation. Fraternization was strictly prohibited. Guards were posted, and reports were written for even minor breaches. But despite these barriers, the shared experience of war, its pain, its vulnerability, slowly shaped the atmosphere in surprising ways. Not softening it, but complicating it. This is the world in which that young American nurse worked. Long before the moment that would alter the course of her emotions, long before she would question the lines drawn between duty and humanity, she lived within a system designed to separate compassion from sentiment, service from personal feeling. Yet systems never fully account for the human heart. And to understand how her story deepened inside these walls, we must explore the broader world of wartime nursing and the forces that shaped her daily life. For nurses serving in wartime Europe, daily life was a constant negotiation between discipline and exhaustion, between professional training and the raw human cost of conflict. By 1944, the U.S. Army Nurse Corps had expanded rapidly, drawing women from across America: teachers, students, farm daughters, hospital trainees, all united by a sense of duty and the belief that their work mattered. Their training prepared them for harsh conditions, but no amount of instruction could fully mirror the emotional weight of tending to thousands of lives, suspended between pain and survival. In field hospitals and temporary infirmaries, shifts blurred into one another. Nights were spent charting vital signs by lantern light. Mornings began before sunrise with the steady rhythm of changing dressings, checking fevers, calming nightmares, and preparing for surgeries that could last hours. Supplies were rationed. Morphine sometimes ran short. Blankets never seemed enough in the damp cold of British winters. Yet the nurses endured, not because they were hardened, but because they had no alternative. Lives depended on their ability to keep moving. In this demanding environment, German prisoners were simply added to the existing weight. They were treated in separate sections of the compound, under guard, but their medical needs were no different from the Allied wounded. Some arrived with burns from aircraft fires, their lungs scarred from smoke. Others suffered fractures from parachute landings or shrapnel from exploding ammunition. A few carried photographs of families tucked secretly inside their torn jackets, discovered only when nurses removed their clothing for surgery. For the American nurse at the center of this narrative, such discoveries were often the most disarming. War taught soldiers to see the enemy as an abstract threat, a plane, a symbol, a force. But a worn photograph of a mother or a child had a way of piercing through propaganda. It reminded the medical staff that the men before them had been sons, brothers, husbands long before they were soldiers of the Reich. Still, protocol demanded emotional distance. The U.S. Army enforced strict regulations. Nurses were forbidden from forming personal relationships with prisoners, engaging in unnecessary conversation, or displaying familiarity. Violations could lead to reprimands or reassignment. In rare cases, charges could follow. These rules were not arbitrary. They were designed to maintain discipline, prevent information leaks, and uphold the integrity of military medical care, but inside a ward where pain softened pride, and where long hours created shared moments of silence, humanity seeped through the cracks. A soldier might whisper a quiet "Danke" when a nurse adjusted his bandage. Another might wince from fear rather than pain, and the nurse would instinctively reassure him. Human instinct often preceded military policy. Many historical diaries from nurses during the war reflect the same emotional conflict. One nurse wrote of treating Italian prisoners who looked no different from the boys we danced with at home. Another described the unsettling feeling of tending to captured pilots just days after her own city had been bombed. The struggle lay not in professionalism that remained firm, but in reconciling the dual identity required of them. A caregiver in a world built on destruction. Within the POW hospital, nurses lived inside a compressed emotional landscape, where the proximity to suffering created a unique form of connection, thin, unspoken, and often unnoticed by those around them. Many nurses learned that compassion was not a weakness but a form of endurance. To care without judgment allowed them to survive psychologically, even as the war pushed them to their limits. For the German prisoners, the experience was equally complex. Many arrived expecting hostility, punishment, or neglect. Instead, they found structured care, clean dressings, and a level of medical attention that surprised even seasoned Luftwaffe personnel. Some prisoners later spoke of this treatment as the first moment they realized how deeply distorted their own understanding of the enemy had been. Within this fragile space, a space governed by rules, but shaped by human instinct, the paths of nurse and prisoner inevitably crossed. Not through dramatic gestures or whispered confessions, but through the small, repeated acts of care that war made impossible to avoid. Over time, such interactions created an undercurrent that neither fully recognized at first. And it is through this evolving tension that the true complexity of their story begins to emerge, a story that cannot be understood without examining the many angles that defined life, duty, and emotion in a world at war. In every wartime hospital, long before strategy and politics entered the conversation, there was a simple truth: humans recognize humanity fastest in moments of suffering. For the American nurse, this reality defined her earliest interactions with the German prisoners. She did not choose her patients. She responded to wounds, to pain, to the instinctive duty every trained nurse carried. Yet even in the act of reaching out, a quiet tension existed, not hostility, but something more complicated. The prisoners often arrived afraid. Some believed they would be mistreated. Others feared the unknown future that awaited them as captured enemy personnel. Their fear was rarely expressed aloud, but it surfaced in hesitant glances, flinching movements, and the guarded way they watched every step inside the ward. The nurse saw these signs not as an enemy would, but as a caregiver did. She noticed the trembling hands, the tightness in the jaw, the eyes that followed her, not with suspicion, but with uncertainty. War taught distrust, but suffering stripped away the propaganda that had shaped both sides. Still, an invisible line separated them, a line enforced, not only by military rules, but by the unspoken understanding of what was acceptable. She could offer comfort, but not warmth. She could steady a hand, but never linger. She could acknowledge their humanity, but never reveal her own vulnerability. Yet the human heart rarely obeys lines drawn on paper. Asterisk behind every medical decision in a POW hospital lay a strategic layer that few civilians ever saw. The war did not pause simply because the wounded wore the emblem of the Reich. In many cases, enemy airmen were viewed as valuable sources of information, particularly those captured after bombing runs over Britain. Their injuries were often severe, but their survival meant intelligence officers could learn about squadron routes, aircraft modifications, or upcoming operations. though the nurse was not part of intelligence. She operated within this ecosystem. She noticed the pattern. Once a prisoner stabilized, military police and interrogators would arrive. Some questioned the men formally. Others observed quietly. A prisoner who died meant lost information. A prisoner who lived extended the chain of intelligence that could protect Allied crews. Thus, the nurse's actions had consequences beyond the ward, even if she never intended them. Every bandage tightened, every fever reduced, every infection prevented increased the likelihood that the man on the bed would later face interrogation. She saved lives because that was her duty, but the war transformed that duty into something larger, more complex. This was the tactical truth. Caring for the enemy was part of defeating him. But this truth rarely entered the nurse's thoughts. Her world was focused on immediate suffering, not distant strategies. Yet somewhere in the background, commanders and analysts made calculations based on her work, turning her simple acts of care into pieces of the broader Allied war effort. This dynamic created an unusual paradox. The same hands that comforted a wounded airman helped sustain the momentum of a war designed to defeat him. Asterisk. If the tactical angle shaped the broader military purpose, the medical angle defined the immediate reality. Medicine was the one domain in the war where nationalism held no authority. The Geneva Convention required equal treatment, and the U.S. Army Nurse Corps honored that principle with remarkable consistency. The nurse lived this principle daily. She moved from Allied patient to German prisoner without hesitation. She disinfected instruments with the same care, monitored vitals with the same precision, and pushed aside her own fatigue with the same determination. Neutrality was not an abstract idea. It was embedded in every action. The injuries she treated were a grim mirror of the war's brutality. Bomb blast wounds, fractures from aircraft impacts, burns from fuel ignitions, sepsis from untreated shrapnel. The human body broke in predictable ways, regardless of the uniform at war. The medical staff could often identify the type of aircraft from the injury patterns alone. Within this environment, prejudice dissolved under the weight of need. A wound did not wait for permission. A patient did not become less human because he belonged to an opposing nation. And for the nurse, each German who survived represented a small victory against the chaos that war created. Yet neutrality had limits. She was taught to protect herself emotionally, to avoid attachments, to maintain the psychological distance necessary for survival. But medicine is intimate work. The act of saving a life requires proximity, physical, emotional, and moral. Over time, that proximity reshaped how she saw the men under her care, and without realizing it, she had already stepped closer to a line she never intended to cross. Wartime hospitals were not simply places of physical recovery. They were psychological crossroads. The American nurse lived in a world where exhaustion blurred into numbness. Long shifts and relentless suffering left little room for reflection. Yet the mind absorbs more than the body reveals. Each day, she confronted echoes of grief, uncertainty, and responsibility, emotions, intensified by the presence of enemy wounded. German prisoners felt an equally heavy psychological burden. Many arrived disoriented not only by injury, but by the collapse of their role as soldiers. Captivity stripped them of rank, purpose, and the structured environment that had shaped their identity. Some were young, teenagers pulled into the war by national pressure. Others were seasoned pilots now forced to grapple with the fear of an unknown fate. Their guards treated them fairly, but they remained prisoners, surrounded by reminders of defeat. In this shared landscape of vulnerability, small psychological bridges formed unintentionally. A nurse adjusting an oxygen mask might catch the fleeting expression of gratitude. A prisoner waking from surgery might find the first face he sees is hers, steady and calm. These moments did not break regulations. They were natural outcomes of war's emotional terrain. But to anyone involved, they carried weight. The nurse felt a quiet guilt when she realized she no longer saw only an enemy in certain patients. The prisoner, too, struggled with gratitude towards someone wearing the uniform of a nation fighting his own. These conflicting emotions created a silent, internal tension neither could name. Yet both felt growing between the ordinary tasks of care. The psychological shift did not appear suddenly. It unfolded gradually, patient by patient, gesture by gesture, until it became impossible to ignore. For German airmen. Being captured by the Allies was a moment filled with uncertainty. Nazi propaganda often emphasized the brutality of the enemy, painting the British and Americans as ruthless opponents. But once inside Allied hospitals, many prisoners discovered a reality that contradicted everything they had been told to them. The American nurse represented a contradiction too striking to ignore. She wore the uniform of the nation bombing German factories and cities, yet she held their lives in her hands with calm professionalism. Her voice, though firm, carried none of the hatred they expected. She treated wounds gently, monitored fevers carefully, and enforced medical tasks with the quiet authority trained nurses often possess. For a prisoner who had survived a crash, lost crewmates, and faced the uncertainty of captivity, such treatment could feel disorienting. Some experienced shame, a conflict between loyalty to their homeland and the undeniable relief of receiving humane care. Others felt a deep, unspoken gratitude, aware that without her intervention, they might not survive. But within that gratitude lay complexity. A POW could not openly express appreciation beyond a nod or whispered thanks. Any sign of emotional connection risked misinterpretation by guards or officers. Still, a prisoner might watch her as she moved between beds, noticing not only her efficiency, but the subtle kindness behind her actions. In the constrained world of the hospital, where days blurred into nights and conversation was limited, these small observations became significant. A bond did not begin with words. It began with recognition, the realization that compassion could exist even across enemy lines. And for one particular prisoner, this recognition would mark the first moment of a deeper internal conflict, a conflict that mirrored the nurse's own. Beyond strategy, psychology, and humanity lay a deeper force shaping this story, the moral tension between what was right and what was forbidden. Wartime regulations were uncompromising. They prohibited personal relationships with prisoners, not out of cruelty, but to preserve discipline and prevent security breaches. Even the appearance of familiarity could jeopardize a nurse's career. The American nurse understood these rules more clearly than anyone. She followed them not from fear, but from a sense of responsibility. Every day, she balanced empathy with restraint, offering comfort while maintaining the emotional distance expected of her role. She lived between two poles: compassion required by her profession, and detachment required by the military. Yet morality is seldom simple in times of war. The act of caring for the enemy forces confrontation with deeper questions. If all lives are equal under medical ethics, what separates ally from adversary in the hospital ward? If compassion is a virtue, why must it be limited? These questions rarely found voice, but they shaped the silent interactions that unfolded between nurse and prisoner. The moral weight of her actions pressed heavily on her, even when she believed she was simply doing her duty. For the prisoner, the conflict was equally sharp. Accepting care from someone wearing the uniform of the enemy blurred the lines of loyalty and identity. This was the moral battlefield neither could avoid. One fought not with weapons, but with internal struggle, restraint, and the constant reminder that war demands boundaries, even when the heart resists them. And it is on this battlefield that their story moved toward a decisive turning point, one moment when regulation, emotion, and circumstance collided. The winter of 1944 deepened, bringing with it the kind of cold that settled into bones and refused to leave. Snowfall became routine. Supplies moved slower. Shifts grew longer. And in the POW hospital, the tension between duty and emotion had begun to tighten in ways the American nurse barely recognized. Yet the true turning point arrived not through gradual change, but through a single, sudden crisis. It began with the unmistakable wail of a siren, not a raid warning, but the short, sharp call for medical emergency inside the compound. A German airman, recently transferred from another camp, had collapsed moments after arrival. He was in critical condition, his breathing shallow, his pulse irregular. His wounds from a mid-air explosion had worsened during transport, and infection had taken hold faster than anyone anticipated. The ward erupted into controlled urgency. Medics pushed aside beds, cleared the surgical table, and prepared instruments. But a shortage of surgeons, a growing problem as Allied forces concentrated for the coming invasion, left the nurse and a single overworked doctor responsible for stabilizing the prisoner. It was the kind of moment wartime staff feared. Too few hands, too much at stake, and no time to think. She didn't hesitate. Training took over. She cut away the soiled bandages, revealing deep wounds mottled with infection. She cleaned the edges with practiced calm, suppressing the instinctive dread that comes when a life hangs on a thread. The doctor barked orders, but she anticipated many of them before he spoke, adjusting the oxygen flow, preparing intravenous lines, monitoring blood pressure that dipped dangerously low. As she worked, she noticed the prisoner's eyes flickering open, searching the room with unfocused panic. His gaze landed on her, and in that fragile second, recognition passed between them, not familiarity, but trust born from necessity. He tried to speak, but she placed a steady hand on his shoulder, whispering a simple reassurance that transcended language. The moment barely lasted, but it altered everything. The doctor soon realized the infection had advanced beyond what simple field procedures could manage. A more invasive operation was needed, one normally performed only in major hospitals. But evacuation was impossible in the storm. If they delayed, the prisoner would die within hours. The nurse prepared the surgical space with a precision that came from years of experience compressed into the relentless pace of war. She warmed the instruments, positioned lamps, and assembled equipment while the wind howled outside the tent. Every movement felt heavier, more consequential, but she forced down the rising worry. The patient was not an enemy now. He was a life slipping away. During the operation, complications mounted. Blood pressure dropped. The infection had spread deeper than expected. The prisoner's breathing faltered. Moments like these defined wartime medicine, the razor-thin margin where the outcome depended as much on endurance as skill. The doctor, overwhelmed and operating near the limits of exhaustion, relied more and more on her. She adjusted clamps, managed suction, stabilized vitals, and communicated every change she observed. Sweat formed at her temples despite the cold. Her hands remained steady, but her mind raced. If he dies, she thought, the war will continue unchanged. But something in her will change forever. Hours passed like minutes. At last, the crisis began to ease. The prisoner's breathing steadied, the bleeding slowed, and the worst of the infection was removed. When they transferred him back to his bed, he looked impossibly fragile, pale, quiet. Suspended between survival and surrender, she remained at his side long after the operation, monitoring his pulse through the shaky quiet of the early dawn. Guards passed by, glancing in without comment. Regulations dictated she return to her other duties. But she could not leave. Not yet. Somewhere in that long, silent vigil, she realized a boundary had shifted. Her concern was no longer just professional. The fear she felt during the operation still clung to her. Not the fear of failing her duty, but the fear of losing him. It was a dangerous realization, one she would never dare admit aloud. But the war noticed changes like this. And soon, so would the officers in charge of the camp. For the moment, however, She only knew the quiet truth settling uneasily in her chest. Something had changed. Irreversibly, and it would not go unnoticed for long. In the days following the emergency operation, the atmosphere inside the POW hospital shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. The German airman's condition remained fragile, and complications lingered. Fever rose and fell unpredictably. Some nights he drifted into delirium. Other nights he barely stirred at all. Yet each morning his pulse grew steadier, his breathing a little stronger, progress that could be measured only in small victories. For the nurse, those small victories mattered more than she expected. She checked his vitals more frequently than the schedule required. Not excessively, not enough to draw attention, just enough to reassure herself that the worst had passed. Each time she approached his bed, she felt the strange, unspoken tension that now accompanied her presence. It wasn't inappropriate. It wasn't visible. But it existed. A thin thread, woven from fear, relief, and something deeper she did not dare name. The guards noticed her attentiveness. Not in a suspicious way, but with the casual observation soldiers develop from long hours of routine. A British sergeant even remarked once, half-jokingly, "You've kept that Luftwaffe lad alive longer than he deserves." She replied with a professional smile, hiding the ripple of unease inside her. Comments like that did not accuse, but they warned. Her internal conflict grew heavier with each passing day. She reminded herself repeatedly that she would have done the same for any patient. And that was true. But what unsettled her was that this felt different. She thought of him even after her shift ended. She replayed the emergency surgery in her mind, remembering not the technical steps but the expression in his eyes when fear and trust collided. Across the ward, the prisoner's perspective shifted too. As his strength slowly returned, he noticed her presence with clearer awareness. He watched her work, the efficient way she moved between beds, the calm authority she carried despite the endless demands of wartime medicine. He said little, partly due to weakness and partly due to the strict rules against unnecessary conversation. But gratitude lived in his quiet nods, in the way he straightened slightly when she approached, in the faintest hint of relief that appeared in his eyes. It was not affection. Not yet, it was recognition. A human connection built from survival rather than sentiment. But the war had no tolerance for connections that crossed its rigid lines. Within a week, officers began reviewing all wards due to a series of POW escape attempts elsewhere in Britain. Security tightened. Guards were doubled. Movement between sections required new authorization. And most significantly, medical staff received a renewed briefing on regulations, a routine measure. According to the commanding officer, but one delivered with unusually sharp emphasis. Maintain strict professionalism, the officer warned. No unnecessary conversations. No familiarity. Any deviation will be documented. The nurse listened, her face composed, though her chest tightened with an unspoken fear. She wondered if someone had reported her, not for wrongdoing, but for attentiveness that could be misread. In wartime, perception often mattered more than intent. Soon after, the reviewing officer conducted a walkthrough of the ward. He paused near the German airman's bed, flipping through charts with a critical eye. Significant improvement, he noted. Remarkably so. She felt her heart thud quietly. "Good medical teamwork, sir," she replied. The officer studied her for a moment, not harshly, but with a soldier's instinct for reading people. Then he nodded and moved on. Still, the message lingered. Her work was being watched more closely than before. That evening, as storm winds battered the canvas walls, the nurse performed her rounds with extra caution. Each step felt deliberate, measured. Yet when she reached the German prisoner's bed, she hesitated. He was awake, his eyes clearer than they had been in days. For a brief moment, time narrowed into stillness. He offered a quiet, Tentative acknowledgement, a slight incline of the head, a faint attempt to speak. But she quickly raised a hand, signaling him not to strain himself. Regulations forbade unnecessary interaction, and she could not risk even small gestures being misunderstood. But as she adjusted his blanket and checked his bandages, she felt the weight of everything unspoken pressing between them, the shared crisis they had survived, the unmarked line they were now dangerously close to crossing. Just then, the canvas flap of the ward rustled. A shadow paused. A guard. He lingered longer than usual, watching her. Not suspiciously, but with the detached vigilance his role demanded. She finished her tasks with perfect professional restraint, then stepped away from the bed. But she knew, with a sinking certainty, that the moment had altered how others perceived her, and perhaps, how she perceived herself. The war allowed no space for emotional entanglements, no matter how unintentional. And in the days ahead, circumstances would force a confrontation neither she nor the prisoner had expected. For even as he healed, orders were already being drafted, orders that would separate them long before either could make sense of what had quietly formed between them. By early spring of 1945, the world beyond the isolation of the POW hospital was changing rapidly. The Allies were advancing deep into Germany. Berlin was tightening under siege, and whispers of the war's end spread through every military corridor. Yet inside the compound, daily routines continued with the same disciplined rhythm, charting vitals, issuing medications, preparing for surgeries, and maintaining the fragile balance between duty and exhaustion. The German airman had recovered enough to walk with assistance. His wounds, once life-threatening, had stabilized into scars of endurance. But as his health returned, his future grew more uncertain. The Allied command now focused heavily on repatriation procedures, classification of prisoners, and the redistribution of POWs to larger holding camps as frontline demands shifted. Hospitals were no longer long-term facilities. They were stepping stones. One morning, orders arrived. The recently stabilized German prisoners, including the airmen, were to be transferred to a secure facility inland. It was a routine decision, one of many carried out every week across Britain as the war edged toward its conclusion. But for the nurse, the word struck with unexpected force. She felt no right to protest, no ability to question. She simply nodded, accepted the papers, and continued her work. Yet the weight inside her chest did not ease. In the following days, the ward prepared the prisoners for transport. Medical files were updated, bandages changed, supplies packed. Guards rehearsed protocols. The efficiency was clinical, designed to prevent sentiment from interfering with military necessity. But the emotional undertone remained quiet, unspoken, but unmistakable. When she reached the German airman's bedside to inform him of the transfer, he listened silently. His expression did not reveal surprise. Prisoners rarely expected to stay in one place. Yet something flickered in his eyes when she explained that another medical team would oversee his recovery. It was not disappointment, nor confusion, nor fear. It was recognition, a subtle acknowledgement that the small, fragile connection forged through crisis was nearing its inevitable end. He murmured a soft danke. The word carried the weight of everything. Circumstances would never allow them to say. She responded, with the steady professionalism expected of her. Yet part of her wanted, irrationally, impossibly, to offer reassurance beyond duty. But regulations were clear, and the unspoken boundary between them remained fixed. On the morning of the transfer, the sky hung low and gray. Military trucks lined the yard, engines idling. Guards assisted the prisoners onto the benches inside the covered transports. One by one, the wounded were lifted aboard, their futures shifting once again into the unknown. The nurse stood a few paces back, clipboard in hand, checking off names. When the airman stepped forward with his guard, he paused. only for a moment, enough to offer a final steady look. Not longing, not pleading. Simply an acknowledgement that in a world built on destruction, they had shared a moment of unexpected humanity. Then he climbed aboard, and the canvas flap closed behind him. The trucks pulled away, their engines rumbling until the sound dissolved into the distant hum of the countryside. The nurse remained still, her breath visible in the cool morning air, her heart caught between relief and something resembling loss. She told herself many things in the weeks after, that she had done her duty, that attachment had no place in war, that the line remained unbroken. All were true. And yet none eased the subtle ache of knowing that a connection formed in the quiet desperation of illness had ended with the efficiency of military orders. But the war was not over yet, and the consequences of those final months would soon reshape not only nations, but the personal histories of everyone who lived through them. When victory in Europe finally arrived in May 1945, the celebrations rippled across cities, camps, and military bases from London to New York. Street lamps glowed through the night, church bells rang without pause, and crowds spilled into public squares in a release of relief that had been suppressed for 6 long years. Yet inside the medical units, the mood was more reflective than jubilant. For nurses who had spent the war tending to both friend and foe, the end of combat marked not a triumphant conclusion, but a quiet reckoning. The American nurse returned to routine assignments as the POW hospital dissolved into a different kind of facility. Beds emptied, wards closed, and equipment was packed for reassignment. But the emotional weight of the war did not disappear with the folding of canvas tents. It remained in the form of memories, some painful, some complicated, some that lingered without clear reason. The German prisoners, now classified for repatriation, entered a long bureaucratic process. Some were sent to work camps for continued labor obligations. Others were held until transportation became available. Many would not return home until 1947, years after hostilities had ceased. The German airman she had helped save was among those moved through multiple facilities, a number in a ledger. A patient file passed from one camp office to another. For him, the memories of the POW hospital remained sharper than most. In later accounts from former prisoners of war, letters, interviews, memoirs, many described the profound impact of being treated humanely by enemy medical staff. They wrote of the bewildering kindness of nurses who tended to wounds without judgment. They noted the confusion of feeling gratitude where they expected hostility. Some even admitted that these experiences marked the beginning of their understanding of a world beyond the narrow ideology in which they had been raised. It is impossible to know whether he ever spoke of the nurse specifically, but the pattern described in the testimonies of thousands suggests that he carried the imprint of that brief, fragile connection long after the war. Not as romance, not as fantasy, but as a memory of humanity in a time designed to strip men of it. For the nurse, the aftermath unfolded in its own sober rhythm. She demobilized with honor and returned to civilian life. Like many women of the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, she was encouraged to resume a traditional role at home, even though the war had expanded her sense of purpose beyond anything she had previously known. She carried the resilience of those years with her, but also the quiet scars, the ones unrecorded in medical charts. Decades later, many wartime nurses reflected on the moments that affected them most deeply. Diaries revealed surprising details: the night they held a dying soldier's hand, the enemy pilot who thanked them in broken English, the unexpected calm over a ward during a storm. The American nurse in this story likely had her own private recollections, memories never fully shared, but never forgotten. For her, the German airman was not a chapter of forbidden affection. He was a reminder of the moral complexity of war, how compassion can cross boundaries even when circumstances forbid it, how a single moment of shared vulnerability can linger more powerfully than the noise of conflict. and how humanity often reveals itself most clearly in the spaces where it should not exist. The war ended. Their lives diverged. Each returned to the world in which they had been born, but both carried with them the same silent truth, that even in the darkest machinery of war, human connection can survive long enough to be remembered, and those memories, fragile yet enduring, became part of the quiet legacy left by millions who lived through a conflict that reshaped the world. War is often remembered in dates, battles, and sweeping movements of armies. Yet beneath those vast events lie thousands of moments that never make it into official histories, moments shaped not by strategy or victory, but by human instinct. The story of a nurse and a wounded prisoner is not a tale of romance or defiance. It is a reminder of something quieter and far more enduring, the resilience of compassion in a world built to suppress it, in the harsh structure of wartime. Every rule, every uniform, every boundary existed to divide one side from the other. Nations required it. Armies enforced it. Survival depended on it. And yet, beneath those imposed separations, people remained human. A nurse saw suffering and responded as she had been trained, with steadiness, skill, and empathy. A prisoner felt vulnerability and placed his trust, however reluctantly, in the hands of someone wearing the enemy's insignia. Their connection lived only in brief glances, silent acknowledgments, and the memory of a crisis survived together. But it revealed a truth that deepened far beyond their individual lives. War cannot fully extinguish the human capacity for recognition, or empathy, or quiet understanding. Even inside guarded wards, even under the strictest regulations, humanity found a small place to endure. When the war ended, they walked separate paths, shaped by different nations and different futures. Yet the moment they shared became part of the broader human story, one of countless, small acts that softened the brutality of conflict. These fragments of compassion, often forgotten or unspoken, are what remind us that history is not only built by generals and governments. It is built by ordinary people who held on to their humanity when the world demanded otherwise. And in remembering them, we are reminded of ourselves, that even in times of division, the heart remains capable of recognizing what is human on the other side of the line.